Welcome to Zero to Start, a podcast about immersive development that brings you inspiring conversations with immersive creators, developers, and industry leaders. I'm your host, SICILIANA. Subscribe to Zero to Start on your favorite podcast platform and follow our new podcast page on LinkedIn. My special guest today is Michaela Ternasky Holland, Emmy Award-Winning XR Director, Creative Strategist, and Impact Producer, leading equity and social change in XR and the Metaverse. A pioneer in VR journalism and experience design, Michaela shares the evolution of her unique industry journey and how her latest immersive film, Reimagined Volume 2, Mahal, is redefining traditional narratives and mythology to create authentic, innovative, heartfelt stories that captivate audiences around the world. Let's get started. Welcome to Zero to Start, Michaela. It's so great to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
If you could tell us a little bit about yourself and what your first aha moment with VR was.
I am going to just come right out and say my story is very unique and different. I was in university studying journalism, and I actually dropped out of my college program to go and work on Disney Cruise Line as a dancer and a performer for 9 months. And while I was on Disney Cruise Line, that is where I discovered just the power of immersive interactive storytelling, where I discovered the power of giving people agency, where I discovered the power of really high end guest service and making people feel seen and making people feel valued. And so I went back to journalism school, really wanting to find a way to make journalism feel more immersive and interactive. And I really tried to play with the pre existing mediums. So, really started trying to play with filmmaking and audio and podcasting and interactive online website experiences and animation. And really just thinking, how can we make journalism feel more engaging for the audience, but also how can we make journalism feel more like a journey for the audience? And it wasn't until after I graduated that I went to a convention as a student volunteer, as a recent grad, that was all about highlighting digital journalism. In that conference, there was one panel called The Future of Journalism, and that panel literally talked about virtual reality and augmented reality. And it was on that panel while I was sitting there and listening to it that I started to realize that that was something I was like so looking for. Like that was something that I had been looking for the last few years. And so I remember just feeling this like wave of hot and cold, and I got chills and I got sweaty, and it was just like I had this like almost like this full body experience where I was like, I didn't know that virtual reality was even a legitimate industry. I didn't even know that people were exploring this type of technology. I didn't even know people were using storytelling with this type of technology. And so that really for me, I think was my first and probably one of my most impactful aha moments when it comes to like this technology and realizing that there's so much possibility and that it even exists. It's such an iconic moment. It like sticks in my brain in such a unique way. I was probably one of the easiest early adopters there were in 2016 because you didn't even have to get me into a headset to see how good the technology was. I just had faith that the technology was going to get better, but was just excited that it actually existed.
That's really inspiring that you had this visceral reaction from the conference. What was your next step?
So after the panel wrapped, I went up to some of the panel speakers and asked them, how could I get involved? And the best advice I got was start with what you already know. And I already knew digital filmmaking. So I started with a 360 video. I had a small consumer 360 camera. I think it was like one of the Kodaks that had two lenses. Like it was two different Kodak cameras, but you would shoot on both cameras, very similar to like the GoPros. And then you would stitch the two lenses together.
Using Pano or something?
Yeah, exactly. Good old Pano. Oh man, stitching was a nightmare for me when I first started. And then shortly after, the Samsung released their 360 camera, the Samsung Gear, and I got that camera, and that camera just really was so incredible because I could just literally turn the camera on, connect it to my phone app, and just start shooting right away. And so started working on 360 dance videos because I have a dance background and I knew a lot of dancers. Started working on my own 360 documentary and started to really think about how you place the camera, how people interact with the camera, how things move around the camera. Especially, I think, again, as a dancer, for me, I think of it less as frame by frame, still by still, like a traditional filmmaker would think about it. And I think about it more like choreography. And then I started doing a lot of research into the broader realm of virtual reality. So I started doing research into game engines, started looking into how volumetric room scale experiences are made. And at that point, I realized I was way out of my depth and decided that I could learn more by volunteering at different conferences. So I remember I volunteered at the first VRLA. I applied for a scholarship to Oculus Connect that year. I also started knocking on the doors of virtual reality companies in Los Angeles, asking if they wanted somebody just to get Starbucks for their team or coffee for their team, just to be an intern in some way, shape, or form. And so that's really where I started my humble beginnings in this industry. And, the universe has a funny way of working everything out for you, I think, in the end. I think the big moment that it all kind of happened for me was when I went to this other event for the Asian American Journalists Association, and I met a professor who I was a huge fan of. His name is Professor Robert Hernandez. He works over at the USC School of Annenberg, and he's one of the only professors at USC who really does teach about VR and AR capabilities. And this is especially kind of like this era that Noni, I think, was on her way out of USC and transitioning into her next steps at Emblematic. So I was like, oh my God, you're Professor Hernandez. You teach about VR, AR storytelling with journalism. And he's like, yes, I do. And I was like, can I show you my stuff? I'm an aspiring VR journalist. And I sent him my stuff, and he was very gracious with me. And he's like, wow, there aren't a lot of people who are actively doing this outside of school or actively doing this outside of an institution. Can I share your work with other people? And I said, yes, feel free to. And so he ended up sharing my work on this community forum with Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Time Magazine, McClatchy, like just basically the heads of all of these innovation departments at all of these major media outlets. And I never saw the message, but he told me that the message basically said, somebody hire her, hurry up. And, a week later, I got the call from Time Magazine to move to New York and come work with them on their virtual reality, augmented reality initiative called Life VR, which is named after Life Magazine. And during my time there, I worked on so many different genres of storytelling within journalism. I worked with the Time Magazine vertical on really cool issues and topics around politics, space. I worked breaking news. I worked with some amazing folks at the Sports Illustrated magazine and worked with them on some documentaries about Mount Everest and some really cool work in their AR department, launching things off the cover of their magazine. I got to work with Sunset Magazine to really highlight the beauty of like national parks and like their annual home that they do every year, and Coastal Living has an annual home. And then I got to work with People magazine, and I got to work with them on film sets and work with like big IP like Dunkirk and Star Wars, and kind of liaisoning with those folks about getting their content onto the Life VR app. And so it was just a really incredibly robust, energetic time in the VR journalism, AR journalism world, working with all those brands to launch AR off their magazine covers and their articles, as well as working on these VR experiences, not just 360 films, but also volumetric VR experiences as well. We actually produced 3 game engine based experiences during my time there, and was just starting work on some of these projects that are now very well known in our industry. I remember I was taking some of the first ever calls with Felix and Paul and NASA, and talking about getting a 360 camera on the International Space Station. And now that's what we know as space explorers. I remember sitting down with Mia, my manager at the time, talking through this immersive MLK experience, which is now known as the March, and it's over at the DuSable Museum. And now there's been a second companion piece to the March, which is currently, I think, nominated for an Emmy. So it's really interesting too, because it wasn't just the work I did while I was there, but there's also like kind of the early seeds of work that I have seen go on and be really prolific, that I also got to be a part of those like early iterations. And that was just a really special time for me. When I decided that it was time for me to move on from Time Magazine, it was because there was a huge acquisition that happened, and there was a big question mark about whether or not we were going to be able to continue doing the work we did. And if we did, we weren't going to be able to cover all these incredible brands like we were able to before. We would really just be focused on Time Magazine. And so I decided at that point, I wanted to keep expanding my skill set. I wanted to start telling stories about women and people of color. And I really wanted to be able to start working in the more of the social impact space and not necessarily the journalism space. I decided to part ways from Time Magazine and started doing a lot of like marketing agency work and started working with Education Above All and did a big AR exhibit for them at the New York Public Library. Started working with smaller indie projects that were premiering at different festivals that had like social impact. But I had this dream, this goal to make my own VR documentary that was not only digital focused, but also physical focused. I have, again, this Disney background. I think there's something really important about never forgetting about the power of our physical reality as much as we love working in the power of digital reality. And so I had met this incredible photojournalist who had been working on this collaboration with this woman who was a victim of gun violence. And they had been working together for years. And they approached me asking me what I would do with the story if I had, unlimited budget. And I pitched them this idea for this physical installation that had a virtual reality documentary embedded into it in a really seamless, authentic way. And they were really excited by it. We were able to get funding from the Sheffield Documentary Film Festival within their annual alternate realities commission. So they commission work the Arts Council of England every year. And so our project was actually able to be funded through that Arts Council of England's commission. It was a nonstop race to the deadline to get the project finished and ready for the festival.
You were able to find your path through all of those to be nimble and to be at the forward edge of journalism and VR and storytelling. And you're making your experiences working with the best brands in the world and able to adapt to the changes in the market when things fell away. Like, how confident were you that this was really going to come through?
I think where I come from as a storyteller and as someone who's really passionate about the possibilities of immersive interactive storytelling is that I try and find the best fit for each story. Or I try to say, why does this story matter and why would this medium matter to the story? So sometimes it's the storytelling techniques that we're trying to portray. So with Face to Face, the woman is a victim of gun violence, and so she has to wear a facial prosthetic. And I was like, wow, like that's crazy, because she's blind and she wears a facial prosthetic. So my pitch was, why don't we create bespoke VR headsets that look like facial prostheses that are all like different skin tones and different eye colors. And literally, what happens when you put on a headset is you become blind. And so there's just this intense embodiment of what we were giving the audience, not just with a VR headset, but even the ritual of putting on the headset had this deeper meaning when you did it through face to face, because the physical exhibit was you were inside her home, you were a guest in her home, you were inside of her living room looking at her photo albums, watching her old home videos, you were literally physically looking at a photo gallery on the wall of the living room that was the photojournalist's photos of her. You would open up little doors and cabinets and find little Easter eggs, basically, of like a newspaper clipping of when the gun incident happened, or you would find a poem that she wrote after the incident, or a painting that she painted before the incident. And so you were really falling into her story from the beginning in this really viscerally physical way. And then once you got into the next space where you put on the VR headset, it wasn't that it looked like this piece of technology, it was that it looked like it was just a piece of the story. And so when you put that on and you played the 360 documentary, it felt like you were falling into a different layer or a different portal of the story. And so for me, like VR was the perfect medium for the story like that, because of the actual technique of the headset, because of the actual technique of the immersive storytelling. Fast forward, a couple of years later, right now I'm working on a story about VR animation. And it's like we're using the platform of Quill to showcase the abilities to actually create and build experiences natively in VR. We're not just using game engine techniques. We're saying we want to showcase that female producers, female directors, female writers can have their stories be told in this incredible way using the power of this VR animation platform. And so that is a lot less about the actual ritual of putting on a headset, and it's a lot more about really leveraging the technology to highlight different voices, to highlight different worlds, to highlight different stories. And so yeah, I think the nimbleness you were talking about, or the flexibility you were talking about, I think for me it's really about like what best serves what we're trying to do. What is our mission? What is our goal? And for me, it's never about chasing the first ever. It's never about chasing the best ever. It's never about chasing the biggest ever. It's always about how do we service the story? How do we service the collaborators? And how is the technology a tool that we work with and alongside of, not this thing that we're trying to overpower and we're trying to conquer and we're trying to colonize, which I think is sometimes other people's approaches to these technologies. And you can feel that sometimes when you experience their projects.
You've been traveling quite a bit, premiering your latest Reimagined Volume 2, Mahal. Tell us all about it.
So it's interesting because a lot of my background is in journalism and nonfiction storytelling and social impact. And even the last year and a half, a lot of my focus has been as an impact producer, helping other creators' stories really come to the forefront, helping other creator stories really reach the people and populations that they want to reach. And Mahal is very unique for me because Mahal is my first foray into narrative. It's the first ever fictionalized script I've ever written. It's also one of my first projects really diving into my indigenous culture. So I've done projects about the Philippines before, but it's usually about modern day Philippines. It's usually highlighting, lack of access to education and the poverty in the Philippines. But, I, as a Filipino American, was just feeling very frustrated to keep telling stories about countries and cultures that just kept them in this rhetoric of third world country, or just kept them in this rhetoric of we need help. And I wanted to dive a little deeper into my heritage and really discover the belief systems of indigenous Filipinos. And that was really my journey of self-actualization. I think, learning more about colonialism and imperialism in the Philippines, learning that the word Philippines is actually named after King Philip, and there's so many different indigenous cultures and dialects in the Philippines, and really getting to learn more about these incredible belief systems, like the mythology, the creatures, the traditions, the folk dances. It was so incredibly empowering for me to see my people in that light. And I was like, other Filipinos deserve to see themselves this way. Other Filipinos deserve to see themselves as gods and goddesses, and not in this marginalized way that we see ourselves as, whether we're a part of the diaspora or whether born and raised in the Philippines. And so Mahal is a really special project for me because it's inspired by Philippine mythology. It's just this incredibly robust animated world that takes you into the Tagalog pantheon, which is a pantheon of gods and goddesses that are anthropomorphic, so they feel and look like humans. And it's a very personal story for me because I had a hard time writing a script. Like, I think now if I were to do it again, I would have, much more respect for the process of script writing. And I am excited to do it again. I want to do it again. But this first time was definitely a learning curve for me. And the thing that I think really helped it click for me was when I got very vulnerable with my personal life and decided that the project's theme was going to be around grief and losing a father, because I lost a father at a very young age. And so bringing a lot of that personal grief experience into the project to really shape all of the characters, Apalaki, the god of the sun, Mayari, the goddess of the moon, Tala, the goddess of the stars, and Hanan, the goddess of the morning and the dawn. It really became sort of this love letter to both of my parents. It became a love letter to my mom, who is Filipino and immigrated here when she was young with my grandparents, and it became a love letter to my father, who died when I was really young. So Mahal's been this really special personal self actualization for me, I think, in VR storytelling, in cinematic VR storytelling, in VR animation, but I think also for me in my personal life.
That's a really special gift when you encounter that moment of inspiration and then the universe confirms it with all of these opportunities where you can learn, grow, and then be a part of the way this industry and storytelling is taking shape, and create this new level of art using a tool like Quill. How can our listeners experience Mahal?
Mahal is currently wrapping up its festival run, but since we are now in the month of November, I will just tell you all we are launching Mahal publicly on all Quest headsets. So if you have a Quest 1, a Quest 2, a Quest 3, a Meta Quest Pro, you will be able to watch Mahal for free starting Friday, November 17th.
Congratulations. Your family must be really proud too.
Oh, well, it's so interesting we're talking right now because actually Mahal's about to make its LA premiere. And for the first time ever, I'm going to start crying. For the first time ever, my mom and my sister are going to try and make it to the premiere. Usually, when I have these project premieres, they happen all the way in New York or they happen abroad. And it's just very hard for them, to afford to travel, and sometimes it's hard for them to get away from their day-to-day lives. But because this is taking place in LA and I grew up about 2 hours north of LA, they're actually going to try and make an effort to come and support me and support the project and kind of see a festival firsthand. And it just really feels like this full circle moment for me and my career, a full circle moment for me and my family. My mom is Filipino American, and I think she's really excited to be able to be a part of this festival because it is a Filipino American film festival. So there's some really, really beautiful, beautiful things that are happening in the coming days and the coming weeks that I'm just very deeply humbled and grateful for.
Can you tell us more about the Reimagined series?
So Reimagined is a trilogy as of right now that is being fully funded by Meta. So it's an anthology series, which means it's a different world, different set of characters, different story, that's all being told by different directors, writers, and producers. And all of our directors, writers, and producers at Mahal are all female identifying. And the one theme that we have in the series called Reimagined is this idea of reimagining different fairy tales, folklores, mythologies, belief systems from all over the world, and reimagining them not just for a more modern, gender inclusive audience, but also reimagining them for this medium of virtual reality. So that is the Reimagined series. Volume 1 was directed by my co creator, Julie Cavalier, who did an incredible job on her volume called Nisa, which is a retelling of a Brothers Grimm fairy tale, The Boy Who Went Forth and Learned Fear. Our retelling of that story is about a little witch who has to learn what fear is and learn how to trust her intuition. And it really is around the theme of fear conditioning in young women. My project, obviously, Mahal, is inspired by Philippine mythology and centers around the theme of grief and losing a loved one or a parent. And the final trilogy, the final volume in our current trilogy is called Young Thang, and it highlights Southern Nigerian folk tales. And it is being directed by the amazing Melissa Joyner, who is a protege of Maya Angelou and comes from a theater directing background. So it's been really fun being able to support her in Volume 3. It is currently in production. We are looking to premiere it sometime next year, so stay tuned for more news around that.
Tell us a little bit about the creative process of working with Quill and how that impacts the way that you're telling the story.
Well, I have to say Quill is probably one of my top platforms for anybody who wants to get involved in this level of storytelling, because what Quill provides you is this fairly low barrier to entry when it comes to creating 3D stories. I think a lot of us feel really intimidated when we open a game engine. We feel really intimidated when we start working in Maya or Blender or these 3D modeling softwares, because those softwares are very intimidating. And I think what I love about Quill is that it's a VR animation, VR painting platform. So it is all native to virtual reality. So once you're in VR, one of your hand controllers is the paintbrush and one of your hand controllers is the toolkit. And whether you have an art background or an animation background, you can very quickly and easily start R&Ding a story. I don't even have an animation or art background, and my process of working with my team was literally getting into Quill and starting to scribble things out, starting to scribble, camera movements. This camera is going to move from here. And I would literally like zoom my camera from where I was in the space to where I wanted it to be. And then it's going to pan out here. And then I would like physically back up, right? And like this embodied way of working in Quill, or I would scribble, like, I don't want the character to move from here to here. I want the character to move from here to here. And I was literally moving in space with my characters, or moving in space with my environments, or, drawing lines from one prop to the space on the environment where I wanted the prop to be placed, or taking a 3D model of a character and setting it down where I wanted it to start its run cycle, and then drawing a line to where I wanted it to end the run cycle. And it just felt so natural and embodied to work in 6 Degrees of Freedom on a 6 Degrees of Freedom project. We were never limited to this 2D interface where we were like, well, we think it's going to work. We have to render it out in the VR headset first to check. Like, we didn't ever have to worry about rendering it out or exporting it out. It was natively already in the headset, ready to be watched or ready to give notes. And so, the process of working in Quill, I think even for my animators, was really freeing, because basically what Quill gives you is this old style of working where you're literally hand painting every single environment, you're hand modeling, hand painting every single character, and then you're basically doing stop motion animation to animate the characters frame by frame. And so for my animators, our animation process on an 18-minute long film took 2 months, but that's not bad when you think about animation in general, and you think about, we're not just animating one character through a scene. We have 4 deities. We have a whole group of villagers. We have animals in the village. We have VFX in the village. We have VFX in the celestial realm where the deities live. We have small details of, like, clothing flapping in the wind, or we have these small VFX animations of like small sparkles. Each of that is hand painted, hand animated. And so I think for me and my team, what it allowed us to do is it allowed us to really R&D and rapid prototype from the beginning, but also be really flexible with how we would change things, whether that was camera movement, whether that was blocking, and made it really flexible for us to keep the story feeling like it was getting better and better, versus feeling like we had to make caveats as to what we were going to work on versus not work on. And one of my favorite parts of the process was really getting to perfect the camera movement, because with Mahal, I think what I was really trying to do is I was trying to create an athletic camera that wouldn't make people nauseous, but would make the experience feel cinematic and make the experience feel all encompassing and wowing. And so the camera movement, we have like circle dolly shots, we have whip pans, we have big cinematic flyover shots, shots that I don't think we would have tried or even attempted back in 2016. And so I'm just so proud of my team. I'm so incredibly grateful. They're some of the best people that work in Quill today. And I just think that all of our hard work and all of our love and all of our passion for the project really is tangibly felt when people watch the project or experience it.
What are some of the key concepts that you think every beginner should know about immersive storytelling?
Always my first note is, does the story need to be told in virtual reality? Does the story need to be told using mixed reality? I think one of the big pitfalls we always fall into is we think, oh, that would be cool, but is it necessary? Because, some social impact projects I work on, they're like, we want this, and we want to reach this many people. And I'm like, woof, if you want to reach that many people, and if you want this and this, maybe VR is not the best format for you. Maybe you need to look at traditional media. Maybe you need to look at, a multimedia strategy and not just focus on VR. And so I think the biggest thing is, what are your goals with this story? When I think about my goals in VR storytelling, especially, I'm going to use Mahal as an example. I want to have a quality over quantity impact. What does that mean? I want the quality of the impact I make on the people who watch Mahal, whether they're Filipino or not, to be at such a level that they come out of the headset and they say to me, wow, I could only watch this and experience this in VR. If I had watched this in 2D, I wouldn't have had the same experience. That is one of my goals with Mahal, is for a quality impact. I want Mahal to be almost a gateway drug for people to want to get involved in VR, to want to see more VR stories, to want to experience more VR content. That's one of my goals. And I think if that's not your goal with your piece of VR content, then you might want to rethink the use of this medium, because it's a very difficult medium. It's a very narrow medium. You can only reach as many people as you can get headsets to, or as you can get into headset. But there is a quality over quantity impact you can have. If you have decided to use VR and you're like, okay, Michaela, thanks for the tip, but I'm already using VR, I already know I want to tell my story in VR, I would say my next tent pole to be thinking about is, who is your audience being casted as? Even if you're doing a 360 VR film, even if you're doing something very passive, very immersive, non interactive, it is still so important that you cast your audience as a role. Because once you cast your audience as a role, it is going to be so much easier for you and your creative team to make the right decisions for the audience, whether that's how you move the camera, whether that's how the audience transitions in and out of the scenes, whether that's how the characters speak to the camera or don't speak to the camera, whether that's the way the environment interacts or does not interact with the camera. And I think it's really important to always come from a place of, the audience is a character. Even if you're working in a documentary format, the audience is always a character. And even in Mahal, the audience or the camera is casted as a very specific character in our story. That character is what really informs some of the camera movement and also informs some of the storytelling choices we made. So, yeah, I would say definitely always cast your audience. And then I think my final thought for you all is, it doesn't have to be photoreal, and it doesn't have to have this level of fidelity that I think everyone is trying so hard to strive.
There's a lot of suggestion and power in the way that you can be subtle and not define everything for the audience, that they fill in just by the natural function of the way the mind works.
100%. And the beauty of VR is that you can play in this ambiguous world. The beauty of VR is you can play in a world that doesn't feel so tied to reality. It can be a little more abstracted, it can be a little more artistic. And then if you are going to bring people into the real world, really make sure you ask yourself why. Always making sure you have a why, and always making sure you are leveraging the affordances of VR, which I know sounds very buzzy, but we lose that North Star so often. So, what are the affordances of VR? The affordances of VR are scale, movement, immersion, going to places you've never been before, being able to put your audiences into spaces and environments that they could only imagine being a part of one day. And so, I think sometimes creators will lose sight of those affordances, and I think the projects that don't leverage them tend to be projects that are really beautiful, but maybe not as compelling for your audience.
You've seen the evolution of the storytelling techniques, the way these big organizations are adopting immersive technology to tell their stories. And now we have the Quest 3 and the excitement over the upcoming Apple Vision Pro. What are your thoughts on the latest headset and Apple coming into the market?
Oh, talking shop. Okay, so I think because if you can see how much I love to talk, you would know that this could go on for a while. I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible. I think the Meta Quest 3 is a really exciting pathway forward because it shows that Meta still has vested interest in this medium. I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen after the Meta Quest Pro. I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen after the Quest 2. But Meta Quest 3 is a really great signal to all of us that Meta is still very much in this game. I think the headset itself, from the times I've used it, is just like what the Quest 1 and the Quest 2 were. It really does just keep improving on a less than perfect system. So what I found was the Quest 3 was a lot lighter. I did find that the pass-through was a lot clearer and in color, which was very cool for me. I think that the exciting parts of Meta Quest 3, which I can't get too much into, but I am kind of working on some small stuff happening in the background. I think the new camera tracking on the Quest 3, whether that's tracking for an MR experience or a full avatar embodiment experience, is really exciting. But I think it doesn't come without its limitations. And I also think that the Quest 3 is going to be an interesting next step because I have not heard from a lot of my indie community of Meta being willing to fund indie content. It seems to me Meta's really focused on these bigger IPs. They're like premium AAA game kind of content. And so I will be curious to see how and when the indie creator market sort of breaks into the Meta Quest 3 ecosystem and what kind of content Meta will be interested in funding at that point. What makes our people so creative, to be totally honest, I think isn't just the fact that we work with such a emerging technology, but that we have to figure out ways to work with this emerging technology's limitations, right? And that makes us, I think, even more creative sometimes with the way we have to approach storytelling, because it's not just a be-all buffet platter, right? Like we know exactly what we can do with mobile apps and mobile gaming. We know exactly what we can do, the possibilities for the most part with creating sort of your standard game engine game, but like with VR and AR and mixed reality, we're constantly, even AI, we're constantly butting up against the limitations of it. And I think that is what makes us resilient in certain ways, which I think I always have such a deep appreciation for our industry and the people in it. I think the Apple Vision Pro for me is very curious. Like I'm sure you've heard this answer a lot, but I think the Apple Vision Pro is going to bring in a new audience that is more focused on the productivity machine, is more focused on sort of what Apple's promises is, which is to make your life more easy and seamless alongside of technology. That to me is kind of like the epitome of Apple. So I think something, like when they first came out with the smartphone or the Apple Watch, they were very, very, very exclusive with who and what got access to developing for that platform and who and what got access to making content. And I think they're going to do the exact same with Apple Vision Pro. It's going to be a really bespoke, very high-end piece of hardware that they are going to use to test the market. They are going to use to test very high-end content as well. And they're really going to shape this as your secondary desktop. They're going to shape this as your secondary iPad. They're going to shape this as get more work done without having to be slumped over a screen kind of experience. And I think that's really exciting because Meta's whole market is really gaming and entertainment. And I don't think anyone has really thought about these tools in a serious, authentic way as productivity tools. I know Meta has worked with Horizon Workrooms. I know Meta's worked with certain kind of productivity toolkits, but I think Apple Vision Pro, the hardware itself, is made first and foremost for productivity. And I think that's a really exciting step. So I'm excited to see not only how it permeates the at-home entertainment sphere, but also the business sphere, the sphere of construction sites, the sphere of training simulations for, HR. I'm excited just to see how this technology from Apple is potentially going to permeate our society at the indie level or even at the storytelling level or even at the gaming level. I think it means that we're going to be locked out of that ecosystem for a couple of years. But I do think that if we can hold on tight for the next couple of years, there will be a really exciting opportunity for us to start to make content for that ecosystem of hardware.
So I'm sure you're working on a couple of things that you can't tell us about, but you recently you just started with a new management company. What are you looking forward to in 2024?
I think where I'm sitting right now is I'm still focused on social impact XR projects. So there's still a couple of those that I'm really excited to be connected to, tied to supporting creators, as well as thinking about my own creativity. Very similar to what I was talking about with Reimagined, social impact is about who's telling the stories and how those stories are being told. And I think it's a big step for us if more XR directors can be represented by Hollywood agents and more of us can have managers to help us manage a career as creative storytellers and be able to get us into rooms with marketing agencies, be able to get us into rooms with big video game companies and production companies. And so, my hope is that I can potentially bring not only XR, but XR storytelling techniques into these spaces, even if that's as simple as teaching Quill and exposing Quill to design agencies as a rapid prototyping tool so that more design agencies are using, Quill when they're trying to 360 storyboard a new immersive project, or they're trying to get a client into a headset to see what the scale of the experiential exhibit would be like, and so it's like little things like that where I think we we all have to be evangelists a little bit, but where
Hmm.
we evangelize, I think, should diversify, and we shouldn't stay comfortable in our bubble.
Is there anything else you wanted to share with us before we wrap up?
The thing I always like to say on these kinds of interviews is that you do not have to be a technologist to get involved in our industry. Our industry is creating a brand new reality, right? Like our reality in the physical world is very much our reality in the physical world, but what we're trying to do with this technology is make the digital reality feel more like physical reality, right? We're trying to make your laptop interface feel more like an immersive world. Making this like seamless transition between the physical and digital reality, as well as building the digital reality, requires a lot of types of people. It requires activists, it requires lawyers, it requires business managers, it requires CFOs, it requires people with medical backgrounds who have expertise in specific areas. And so if you're saying, hey, I think the XR industry is really interesting and cool, but I have nowhere to start and I don't even know if I have the right skill set. I literally went to school for journalism, dropped out of school, and did Disney Cruise Line, and I work in XR. Like, I just want people out there to know that this isn't a huge barrier of entry. Like, we really could use all different types of people in this industry, because my hope and my dream for this industry is that we start now to be more diverse, more inclusive, more equitable. We start now by centering Indigenous voices. We start now by centering female identifying voices. We start now by centering LGBTQIA voices. We start now by creating ethical practices. And all of us from different walks of life have different points of views that are really valuable to how we're building and creating this new digital reality structure using these technologies.
What an inspiring conversation today. I hope my listeners are just as inspired and enthusiastic about diving into their ideas as I am. Thank you so much, Michaela, for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the premiere season. Congratulations on Mahal being released on the Meta Store.
Thank you so much for having me, and I just appreciate this conversation today.
I hope this episode of Zero to Start inspires you to explore how you can make an impact with immersive tech. Be sure to download Reimagined Volume 2, Mahal, when it lands in the Meta Store later this month. Check the show notes for links to Michaela's website and more. You can support Zero to Start by subscribing to us on your favorite podcast platform. Give us a rating and share this episode with your community. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy installing.